Navigating the combination is about the real decisions in combination product development, the trade-offs, the judgment calls, and the things that don't fit neatly into a guidance document.
Each episode, we sit down with leaders from across drug delivery to talk through what's actually changing and the strategic challenges of bringing a drug device combination product to market.
Our team has touched more combination products than we can count. From early strategy through launch and post-market, we've seen what works, what doesn't, and what keeps people up at night.
We're former pharma, former device, and former FDA. And now we're bringing the people we've worked with onto the show.
This is what we've learned. Let's help you do it right the first time. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Navigating the Combination. I'm Parth joined here with my co-host, Jonathan Amaya-Hodges. Today, we have Jeff Gensler from Excella Pharma Sciences. We had a great conversation with Jeff where we discussed the differences between pharma and device culture, device decisions that he'd make differently, and his insights from a CDMO perspective. We hope you enjoy. All right. Well, hey, Jeff, how are you doing today?
Good. Very good.
All right. So it's really great to have you on. And, I'm excited for the guests to hear a little bit about your journey here. And so before we get started, do you want to share a little bit of how you came into combination products and where you are today?
Yeah, no, it's good to see you again, Parth, and good to talk to you. So I'm Jeff Gensler. I've been in regulated industry for probably about 30 years. I started off in medical device and really worked my first probably about 15 to 20 years in medical device. From there, I had an opportunity to move into a combination device company or site for Pfizer. So that really then brought me into that realm. In the device side, I was responsible and worked on a couple different warning letters. So, I've had a lot of experience and a lot of, in-depth experience working with FDA on the CDRH side. So I really thought coming to Pfizer and working on the combination device was the next big step for me in my career.
That's amazing. I know you and I have had a lot of experience together. And, when I first met you, you had just walked into Pfizer Meridian. You brought a great device background and, we were undergoing a warning letter, a drug shortage, and FDA telling us to, reevaluate the product. Do you want to kind of share your, how your first 90 days were and your experience just stepping right into that?
Yeah, it was an interesting time. When I came in, actually the first day, FDA had just left like a week prior to me arriving. Day one was kind of stepping in and writing response. So it was a great way to learn kind of what the issues were and what we were seeing. Right away, it was pretty obvious that there was some gaps with the 820 requirements from a combination device perspective around design, around some of the data concepts, supplier management. I think really kind of were the big things that stood out, from that perspective. But shortly on the heels of writing that response, FDA had come back with several questions. So I think we had about 15 meetings with FDA that was around June, July to like September, October, and then they came back again in November. CDRH came in for a couple weeks in November. Actually, prior to that, they had gone out to our supplier, one of our critical suppliers, and audited them. And it was interesting that they actually brought the 483s back from the supplier to us and issued those 483s to us. So that was really the first time in my career I saw that happen. But it really to me was really showed the criticality of and the way the FDA was looking at suppliers and critical suppliers in the supply base.
What would you say, you just mentioned, right? Hey, as FDA was at the supplier, they brought back some 483s that came back to the organization. What would you say surprised you the most, right? Like in terms of the whole first few months you were there and how the organization was operating?
Yeah, so I mean, coming from strictly device perspective, I think some of the things that really stood out were, the lack of the organization on design control and what we were doing there. But what really kind of stood out for me was the way we were managing data, and we were using a lot of attribute data. And I think that's pretty common in pharma. Pharma, when they talk about AQLs and things, they talk about them in Z1.4 usually, and that's really attribute data. So it was pretty obvious to me that, some of the things that we were doing was more kind of pharma based and not 820 based, and there wasn't a lot of use of statistics either at that time. So I think some of those things were what stood out to me the most.
Yeah, so you certainly highlighted some important areas where there's differences between drug and device world. Is there any other approaches or philosophies that you saw that really differentiated those that, of course, then had to be bridged for a combination
I
product?
think the other big one is CAPA, right? I think this is an area that combination devices struggle in a lot, right? I think coming from med device, CAPA was more systemic, big CAPA. You would use it for significant issues or trend violations, or things like that's major issues, and it was more systemic in nature. A CAPA for pharmaceutical ends up being a little bit more action related, that are actions out of investigations. So they talk about CAPA as CAPA actions. And so I think a big part of the combination device space is really translating kind of between 820 and 211, and especially in the CAPA area.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, CAPAs are always subject of inspections and a lot of times end up in those 483s and warning letters. So it's important.
Yeah, they're usually front and center. And, that's the other thing that was very common for us to do in device, like for, regulatory inspections, everything would go through CAPA. And I think pharma has come around to that, and pharma is doing more of that now. But, I think that was a big difference kind of in the two. So it was a big learning opportunity for us. From that point, though, shortly after kind of that FDA inspection, we met with FDA, and I think it was an interesting meeting. It was with Janet Woodcock with FDA, who was one of the top people.
Mm-hmm.
And with this product, it was always very important because it was emergency use. Drug shortage was very important as well. So we were kind of balancing between drug shortage and improvements. But what they told us coming out of that meeting was basically that the design, we had to go to a brand new design. There's no way that design would ever meet the reliability requirements. And that was the reliability requirements were issued in 2017 on a pre-market PMR, pre-market report. And that was issued, and that was really kind of the ground zero of the 5.9's requirements for emergency use auto injectors. So we were really the first company to take a design from its current design into meeting the 5.9's reliability.
Yeah. As you're talking about that conversation, I'm sure you had to face a lot of difficulty in terms of making challenging decisions, right? And sometimes the decisions that you're making don't always work out the way you're expecting, whether it's, for the situation you're talking about, any products that you've worked on. Are you willing to share maybe like an example of something that may or may not have worked out the way you were expecting and the lessons learned that you took away?
Yeah, no, I think there was a lot that didn't work out the way I expected. Some were positive, some were not positive, right? I think a couple things that come to my mind, and things that we struggle with today too, like, when we talk about reliability, process capability is at the center of reliability, and you have to have capable processes to meet the reliability requirements. As we looked at our processes to meet those reliability requirements, we had to switch from attribute to variable data.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you have these legacy processes that have been running for a long period of time. And if you switch attribute to variable, a lot of those processes aren't capable, and you have to do process work to get them to a capability level. So one of my big learnings on the heels of that was, you got to be careful as you're transitioning and making sure that you're doing the process work and devoting time and effort to make sure that you do that process work to improve your processes prior to switching over to the new way of evaluating processes. And we had a great example that came up. As we switched from attribute to variable data, we were able to significantly reduce our sample size because we got a lot more data from a lot less components.
Mm-hmm.
We had a situation where we had a component in one of our subassemblies that was a critical component, and what we saw at receiving inspection, we saw a shift downward in CPK, and that shift, when we investigated it, turned out to be related to a single cavity from the multi-cavity tool that was being used in the plastic injection molding process. So we were able to find that problem and go back to the mold and actually see that the mold had been wearing and was in need of repair, and fix that mold prior to having any out of spec components. And if you kind of wind that back to when we were looking at attribute data, we wouldn't have been able to find that problem until we had an out-of-spec part. And then once you have that out-of-spec part, now you have this whole supply chain that's full of components that then have to be evaluated, dispositioned, and a lot of times scrapped. So there's millions and millions of dollars that we were able to save by the approach of the variable data and looking at process capability and ensuring that our processes are consistently stay in a state of control and highly capable.
How would you say, right, as you're talking through that example, right, there's two balances. There's a balance from having that supply continuity and probably the short-term pressures of getting there versus the long-term lead time changes of making sure that you're actually fixing the root of the problem.
Yeah.
How would you balance that, right? Like if someone were to ask you that question, where's that balance come from?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we look at those type of balances and those changes, it always starts with the risk to patient, right? So we always start from the patient and then work back. So we look at the risk to patient, anything that has a high risk to patient, that's where we want to go after first. And then once that's covered, if you're looking at things like tolerance stack ups or things like that, when you're looking at kind of the reliability numbers, then I think it's, you go after the ones that are probably not going to have the biggest impact. I think when you're talking about molding changes and things like that, there ends up being a lot of supply and a lot of WIP that's in the supply chain. So making a change really, you can make it today, but you might not be able to start implementing it for a year from today. So I think you have to look at all those factors as well, as far as what the inventory, what the turns are on the components, and really stay working closely with the supply chain.
Yeah. And let me add that, right? Like you had mentioned, sometimes these changes can be, up to a year to actually see them be fully implemented and incorporated into, your standard manufacturing. I can definitely see situations where like leadership could come back and say, hey, this is too long. And they might say this change isn't worth it. And they're fighting to sort of push you down a different pathway. Could you talk a little bit about your experience with that?
Yeah, I think what I've learned in my career, and I've learned it in a couple different ways, but I think a lot of times, especially us quality people, will go and say, "Hey, we need to make this change. This is how we're going to do it, and this is how long it's going to take."
Mm-hmm.
I think when we present that data, we don't always have all the details behind it and why it's going to take that long. And I think sometimes the top management don't understand the supply chain challenges and how that all works. So I think going into it with all the facts and kind of being prepared for those questions up front, I think is the most important part. I think a lot of times too, we go into changes where there's potential cost reduction, right? And I think an example is the attribute to variable data. We were able to save, I think, $5 or $6 million a year by turning that on. We were able to go from 800 samples of finished good to 80, and then all the components through the chain was 800 to 80. Now, to do that, it took a pretty significant investment. But what we were able to do is put together a business plan and present that as a business plan. And not only say, hey, this is for compliance purposes, but also get the business win as well. So I think that's the way I think as quality professionals we need to do a better job of up front, is looking at not only just compliance only, but how do we then link that to the business and drive the business improvement as well? So building that case, putting that data together, building that business plan, I think is what really then puts you in a better position to be able to implement these critical changes.
Great
I think
example.
a lot of times when you don't do that, quality will say, hey, we need to make this change. And then the business will say, well, no. And then we just walk away and say, oh, darn, they don't get it. But I don't think we do it justice in preparing it either.
Yeah, I agree absolutely with the cost of quality not always being considered. And the business case is really important to justify, like you said, not just you need to do it for the sake of doing it. Another kind of change gears a little bit here. Understand that you're now at a CDMO supporting combination product drug space. Interested in how that's compared, contrast to your time in industry on the direct manufacturer sponsor side.
Yeah, when we were at Pfizer, it was essentially a CDMO because they were selling it. I think we were selling it through a different company. Essentially, that was CDMO. But during that time, we were purchased by a private equity, and we started to build out more of a CDMO model. When in doing that, we brought in the sterile injectable isolators and then all the equipment end to end. And I think it was really interesting to me to drive some more through that process, innovation through use of technology. And I think that's something that, I think that the industry and quality specifically is lagging behind on. So in doing that, as part of that process, I was able to get some visibility into kind of more of the state-of-the-art processes. And when I talk about those, I talk about more like paper-free batch records, right? Things like more data collection, end-to-end of processes, process capability, process monitoring, continuous process validation. And these things really resonate with me to really drive more of a proactive quality approach rather than a reactive quality approach. So that's kind of what interested me in the CDMO space. And where CDMO space is right now, especially in sterile injectables. With the advent of Annex 1, right, there's been a big shift in the industry towards more current state manufacturing processes and isolators. And with that comes the technology that includes process monitoring, continuous process validation, things like that. I think from that point forward, that's kind of where I really see quality also now becoming less of a cost center and more of a competitive advantage. And, I think as we continue to expand here and, sponsors are expecting more and more out of contract manufacturers, especially in the area of quality. And by us taking a more proactive approach in those areas, I think it's going to set us up for success and also help the industry, because I think contract manufacturers historically have been a problem of concern from FDA's perspective because they're kind of out of sight, out of mind, kind of like third-party manufacturers. They're not front and center with FDA, and FDA doesn't always have visibility of them. So I'm really excited about kind of the shift we're seeing in industry with CDMOs. And I really want to be part of changing the way we look at quality within our space as not just a requirement by FDA, but more of an additive business advantage by being more proactive than reactive and really focusing on right first time rather than right at the end of the line.
That's great. And you were starting to touch on this a little bit, but what do pharma companies in particular get wrong when they're dealing with combination products or devices? Maybe if there's anything beyond what you've already discussed on the stats side.
Yeah, I think the big difference is really process controls and how we're controlling our processes. I mean, you think about kind of from a pharmaceutical perspective, it's more of kind of a batch processing. You're mixing 4 or 5 different chemicals together. And a lot of times then you can verify those at the end of the line. And so I think pharma has historically been more reliant on QC functions and the QC, whereas, we don't, in the device side, we really don't have that opportunity, because to test our devices, typically it's a destructive test and you can't. So then process verification isn't really an option. It has to be validation. So, and for me, this validation is ultra critical. And I think that's where kind of there's a difference in understanding. I think from a pharma perspective, it's more of equipment qualification. And from a device side, it's full process validation. And I'm a big believer in process validation to really understanding and learning your processes as much as a checkbox for compliance. So understanding what the processes are today, but then also continuous monitoring. I mean, because a lot of times we go into validations and we'll do a PQ, we'll do 3 lots. Well, 3 lots certainly don't represent all the sources of variation, right? So you're not capturing all your variation within those 3 lots. Whereas with continuous process monitoring, then you can learn and understand what those variations really, how they impact your processes over time, and then better manage and better control them forward so you can prevent failures rather than try to correct them at the end.
Great, more proactivity.
Yeah, and more validation, right? I think from a validation perspective, we talk about IQ, OQ, PQ, and really OQ to me is understanding your parameters and your critical parameters and understanding where the limits are within your process. And then trying to center your process within those limits. A lot of time that gets missed, and we just kind of guess at the best spot within the process. But we could be located at one end or the other, and then when you see any process shift, it takes you out of spec. And then once that happens, then you're back to process development again. So I think really doing the work within the OQ is so important.
Right. And shift back to something we were discussing discussing before, given your work on multiple FDA enforcement actions, warning letters, what have you taken away from that in terms of trends and ways that industry as a whole could improve?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think the first thing I've taken away is don't get into trouble with FDA. Stay VAI. It's easier to stay VAI than it is to get from OAI to VAI. But no, I think I think I think from an industry perspective, we can get kind of relaxed in quality when there's not something driving us to stay more focused. So I think my learning is I think we always have to be driving and have to be improving quality, and it's not just quality. It's everyone. It starts with designing in quality from the start, design for Six Sigma, all the way then through process development, designing our processes to be highly capable, and then continuous monitoring. And I think that's to me the key, and it's all about for me is process capability. And it starts with the right limits from a design perspective. If you have a design that has too tight of limits, and I've seen this many times where the design has too tight of a limit and then it's not manufacturable, and then you start having manufacturing failures, and that causes havoc in your process system, and can be very traumatic to the organization. I think getting those things, focusing on those things, getting those right from the start is ultra important.
So with that, Jeff, I want to first and foremost thank you for, taking the time to talk to us today. Before we close this episode, one closing question for you. You have a ton of, quality leadership experience in all the roles that you've been in, and there are people every day, or, maybe people that might be just stepping into a quality leadership position at a combination product company for the first time. If you could tell them one thing, what would you tell them? You're welcome to say two if it's easier to say two.
Well, there might be two or three. I think a couple things I would say, right? I think first, understanding process capability, statistics. Statistics for me have been foundational, and I think understanding statistics, the use of statistics, the use of data is ultra important. And then the other thing I would say is, and this is something I've done, and I think it's helped me learn a tremendous amount. I mean, there's always going to be situations and what I call fires. I've always run into the fire, not away from the fire. And I think when you run into those fires and you have those opportunities to run into those fires, and there's a situation like a warning letter or 483 or a supply shortage, to jump into those both feet, because those are the opportunities and the things where you learn the most are in those situations. I mean, there's from, when you're working in like a remediation, I think you can get years of learning within months based on the amount of work that's being done. So, when you have those opportunities, take them, jump in both feet, and jump in, be engaged, and learn from them.
Great.
Jeff, I can attest to everything you said, because I saw you practice that live in my experience. And so with that, I do want to thank you again, and thank you for the time that you spent today.